The status of Europe as one of the beacons of freedoms on the world stage suffered a fresh blow last night. The Polish parliament passed a draft law which prohibits companies from outside the European Economic Area from owning Polish broadcasters. The law clearly targets the largest private TV broadcaster, TVN, known for its critical coverage of the ruling populist party Law and Justice, because it is 100% owned by the US-based company Discovery. What are the consequences of this law for the people of Poland? We'll try to simplify this complex matter with IPI Europe Advocacy Officer Jamie Weissman, who has followed this case very closely. My name is Javier Luque, and this is Today in Short, an IPI podcast. Hello, Jamie.
Hi, Javier.
Let's start. So what is this law and why is it widely known as LexTVN?
So the so-called LexTVN is a bill which would essentially ban non-European ownership of Polish media. Now, the government says it's aimed at tightening existing rules on foreign media ownership, and it's about limiting the ability of states like China or Russia to own domestic media. But the issue is that there's only one media company that would be affected by the law, and that's TVN, Poland's biggest private broadcaster, which is owned by the US media conglomerate Discovery. Now, importantly, TVN owns a number of different channels in Poland, including TVN24, which is the most watched and influential independent news channel in the country, which is critical towards the ruling party. So it's really clear that this law is directly targeted at forcing the sale of TVN, opening the door to government allies to step in, and kind of forcing a shift in the editorial stance to one more favorable of the ruling party.
So what have just happened? I mean, can you give us a timeline of the case? So when did it start and how was the law approved last night, Wednesday, August 11th?
Well, it's important to note first that TVN has long been in the crosshairs of the Law and Justice Party for its critical coverage. Since the party swept to power in 2015, there have been multiple attempts to discredit its journalism, apply regulatory pressure, and make extortionate retroactive tax demands. And up until now, strong pressure from the US has been enough to ward off most of that pressure. But to bring it up to date, in July, Law and Justice lawmakers submitted a bill to Parliament which would bar companies from outside the EEA from owning more than a 49% stake in Polish media. Currently, Discovery owns 100% of TVN through a subsidiary which is registered in the Netherlands to comply with the current rules. But this law would force TVL to sell 51% of its shares, which are currently valued at over $1 billion. So in the run-up to the vote, there'd been a lot of criticism by media freedom groups, opposition to the bill from the US and the EU, a letter of support for TVN's independence, which was signed by more than 800 Polish journalists, and multiple demonstrations held across the country. And to make things even more unstable, in the wake of the vote, the Prime Minister sacked his Deputy Prime Minister, who's the leader of a junior coalition partner, over his vocal criticism of the media law, which frayed the government's majority even further. So the vote itself in Parliament was fast-paced, chaotic, and controversial. And initially, the opposition succeeded in narrowly securing the majority of votes in favour of postponing the session until September. Outside Parliament, protesters who had gathered began celebrating, opposition MPs began giving interviews, and international media started publishing headlines the law had been dealt a serious blow. But this jubilation quickly turned out to be short-lived, however, as inside the Parliament, Law and Justice demanded a redo of the postponement vote. Eventually, the Speaker of the House, who is a Law and Justice member, approved the second vote, saying that she'd made a mistake by not specifying when the date would be held. When the vote was held again, after a few backdoor deals, a number of MPs from one party switched their vote and sided with Law and Justice. This obviously led to outrage and accusations of foul play by the opposition. So the original vote went ahead, and in the end, the lower house approved LexTVN with 228 MPs in favour and 216 against.
I mean, you just mentioned the part of the protests, right? So I have the feeling that a significant part of Polish people was against the law, or at least this is what we can interpret from the several protests in 1880, I think, right? Different towns and cities that took place days before the bill was discussed and passed in the lower chamber. So talking about the people, what will be the impact of this law for the population?
I mean, TVN is a main source of news for millions of Poles across the country. Its news channel and its evening news shows are the most highly watched in the country, and unlike the public broadcaster TVP, it offers a more balanced view of the world. It broadcasts investigative reports and government scandals. It actually adheres to journalistic ethics, and it gives fair airtime to the opposition parties. So it's a source of independent information. And if it's silenced or taken over by government allies, I really think a large segment of the population will lose its main source of trusted news. But it's not about this one channel. I think it's about the principle of independent media and how they can operate without government interference. So I think that's why we've seen a number of protests across the country.
Mm-hmm. So given the track record that the current government of the Party of Law and Justice in Poland, so it seems that this is just the latest attempt of law and justice of the party, to gain direct or indirect control of the media. So can you give us a summary of the steps Poland has taken, or its government has taken so far in this direction?
Well, immediately after taking power, the party passed laws and took over the public broadcaster TVP, firing journalists and placing loyalists in positions of power on its oversight boards, which slowly deformed the broadcaster into a government mouthpiece. After that, a kind of mixture of regulatory, economic and political pressure was applied to different private media that were critical of the government, aimed at starving them of advertising resources, driving readers and viewers away, and creating an unstable climate for investment. But I think the centerpiece was really this plan for so-called repolonization, which would push out foreign media owners and have Polish owners close to the ruling party step in. Last year, in a move that we haven't seen anywhere else in Europe, the state-controlled oil giant PKN Orlen, which is headed by a law and justice loyalist, bought Polska Press, a publisher which owns 20 out of the 24 regional daily newspapers in Poland and hundreds of local websites and newspapers. And since then, pro-government figures have been appointed to head the company, editors have been purged, journalists have left in protest, and criticism of the government has slowly been muzzled. These different kind of tactics combined have really given Law and Justice much greater direct and indirect influence over the country's main media ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. So on a broader picture, it seems that Poland is emulating Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? So in fact, recent reports which you have authored have raised awareness about the Urbanization of different countries in Europe.
Well, yeah, I mean, all those steps I just mentioned, they're right out of the Fidesz playbook. Capturing public media, discrediting and demonizing the critical press, instrumentalizing state advertising revenue to starve independent media of financing, creating a hostile climate for foreign investment, pushing out foreign owners, and then having companies linked to the government take them over. All of these policies erode independent journalism and weaken pluralism. And in Hungary, these tactics have been, really quite concerningly successful over the last decade in sidelining critical media and cementing a kind of dominant pro-government narrative in the country. And in Poland, the use of a state oil company, PKN Orlen, to buy a private media company, that was the really big sign that Law and Justice are deploying some of those same tactics for state-led media capture that are used in Hungary. And this LexTVN is another worrying step down that path that Orban and his party have created. And worryingly, I think we're seeing more and more governments within the EU employ these tactics themselves.
And what's the reaction of the European authorities in front of all these actions? I mean, both Poland and Hungary are members of the European Union.
I think we've seen top figures within the European Commission speak out against these laws. Like we've said, while it's clear the bill is targeted directly at TVN, it appears that Brussels currently has little space to act, as the bill isn't currently in violation of EU legislation. So right now its toolbox really isn't developed enough to step in and act or penalize Poland for attacking media freedom. That means that up till now it's really been the US that's been speaking out much more strongly. $1 billion of US investment are at stake, and of course US interests in the country are threatened. We know there have been diplomatic efforts behind the scenes. The State Department has issued stark warnings over the future of Polish-US cooperation if the law is eventually passed. And last night we saw the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, issue a statement criticizing the law. And there have also been reports that the US President is following events himself as well. But crucially, that there is still time for the US and the EU to act. The next steps in this legislative process are that the bill will go to the Senate, the upper house of Parliament, for approval. As it's opposition controlled, it's expected that the Senate will reject the law and send it back to the lower house, possibly with amendments. There, unfortunately, Law and Justice then can technically disregard the suggestions and only need to muster another majority to get the bill over the line. Only then will it appear on the president's desk for a signature. There he can either sign, veto the law, or send it to the Constitutional Tribunal. So I think going forward, much stronger pressure from the US will be vital in ensuring that this bill isn't ultimately passed. Now, it's important to stress that there's a long way to go yet. There's no doubt that there'll be many more twists and turns, more dramatic debates and votes in Parliament, and it's not guaranteed that the Law and Justice will be able to pass this law. But what is clear is that the vote yesterday in the lower house was a really major step forward for the government in this regard, and a significant win in its drive to repolonize the Polish media landscape.
Thank you very much for your time, Jamie, and for this very insightful overview into the last night approved law and following steps that need to be taken in order to counter this law. Thank you very much for your time.
Many thanks, Javier.
That's it for today. So please share this episode with your colleagues and friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, IPI Podcast. We are on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, and other platforms. That's it. See you on the next episode of Today in Short.